So why use stories and metaphors in therapy? Well, there are many reasons that stories and metaphors can be helpful for therapy. One of them is to lay down and update neurological patterns. So the brain works essentially like a pattern matching machine. And so if you want to lay down or update those patterns, one way to do it is through stories or metaphors. You can allow problems to be seen from an observing self position. So we'll talk about the observing self in a future lecture. But what you're doing is letting someone see their problem from an objective position where they're not absorbed in the story, they're not absorbed in the feelings and emotions of that story. You can use stories and metaphors to stimulate neurological patterns. So rather than just laying down the patterns, say you want somebody to think of something very specifically, like say their relationship they had with a parent when they're a child. You can tell a story perhaps about something that's happened to you when you were a child, and because you're telling a story about your childhood, the neurological patterns to that will be stimulated within the brain of the person you're talking to, so they will find it easier to think about their own childhood. It makes something more memorable. So if you just give facts to someone, or you're trying to tell someone how they should, for example, stop smoking, and so you say you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do this and you need to do that and you need to do this, that's not as memorable as when you package something in a story and you tell a story about something. It's a way of engaging all of the senses. So again, if you just clinically say what you need to do to lose weight is, or what you need to quit smoking is, that doesn't really engage all the senses. Whereas you can tell an engaging story, bringing in visual, auditory, kinesthetic, perhaps olfactory, gustatory senses. You can bring in all of these senses, and that makes it a real kind of experience for the individual. And that leads on to the next point of how it can absorb attention. So it's often said that one of the oldest hypnotic inductions is saying, once upon a time. Because as soon as you say once upon a time, people instantly go into a kind of receptive state, ready to receive the story you're about to tell. They suddenly lock onto you. If you say to somebody, you'll never guess what happened the other day, you're about to tell a story about something, and so you can absorb that attention. Stories can offer a shared language. So everyone's probably experienced that experience where you're trying to say something, but you don't quite know how to explain it. And so you tell a metaphor, or you tell some kind of a story that you know will help people to understand it. And a lot of scientific leaps have happened where someone has thought about something in a metaphorical kind of way, and then to explain what they mean, like Einstein talking about the speed of light by talking about travelling on a train travelling at light speed, and how he explains about relativity by talking about the clock on the platform versus the watch on the passenger's wrist who's on the train. And so you can offer a shared language where you're talking perhaps about something that's difficult to put into words, and so you use a story instead, that you both kind of know what you mean. And using stories and metaphors can bypass resistance, so you can get ideas across to the client without having the resistance of the client thinking, you're telling me what to do and I don't want to do it, or whatever kind of resistance they might present with, because you're just telling a story. And so some stories you tell may not even be relevant for the client, but because you've just told it as a story, if it's not relevant and it's not a relevant pattern and you've perhaps missed the mark a bit, it doesn't matter because the client just takes it as listening to a story. So resistance often happens when you're telling someone to do something and they're not doing it. So metaphors run deep. We use metaphors without even really paying attention to the fact that we use them. To find metaphors that you're going to use with clients, you want to listen and observe for common everyday metaphors. So I say listen and observe because you want to do more than just listen, because people will do metaphors not just with words and phrases, but they'll do metaphors with their actions. Individuals will have their own personal metaphors, and everyone has their own personal interpretation or meaning to metaphors. So, for example, if I spoke about the ugly duckling, I'd be telling the story of the ugly duckling. I would have my own meaning of what I think that means and my own interpretation to that. But the person who I'm talking to will interpret it in their own unique way. So at best, all you can ever be is reasonably sure about the direction that they're likely to take with the metaphor. You can't be sure exactly what it is that they're going to interpret and think it means. So we have a lot of metaphors that can be used not just as words and phrases, but as actions. So, for example, cold shoulder. People will say, oh, they gave me the cold shoulder. But what you also get is people that get like a frozen shoulder. And they'll present it as an actual problem that they'll think is a physical problem. They'll think maybe they've got a joint problem. And there may be, when a doctor takes a look, seemingly no known cause for this frozen shoulder. But what you find is that it's psychosomatic and that it's a cold shoulder because it's a metaphor for something real. Maybe a partner's giving them the cold shoulder, or they're giving their partner the cold shoulder, or they want to give someone the cold shoulder and they're not. So they keep thinking about this idea and this metaphor, and they're not carrying it through in their real life, so they've caused it for themselves. Pain in the neck is another one. That again could be that maybe their partner is a pain in the neck, and they genuinely experience the physical sensation of having a pain in the neck, psychosomatically. Scratching the surface. So people say, we only just scratched the surface of this. So that's a metaphor that's very commonly used that could lead to somebody scratching a lot. Then you've got other metaphors, like people talk about getting stuck in a rut. They can talk about wanting to get perspective on something. So you could use those by, for example, telling a story about a car getting stuck on a road, getting stuck in a rut on a road, if they've talked about getting stuck in a rut. Or you could talk, for example, I quite like using the story about the toad who's hopping along the road and then hears someone going, help me, help me, help me. And he hops along and he sees down this hole that there's a toad down the hole. And he tries to reach down, tries to get this toad out, and this toad can't jump out and can't seem to reach up. And so the other toad ends up saying to this toad, look, if you jump down here into the hole, I can stand on your back and I can jump out. And that toad says, well, yeah, but then I'm going to be stuck in the hole and I don't want to be stuck in the hole. So the first toad then just hops along, carries on his journey, says, sorry, but I can't help you. If you won't help yourself enough, I can't help you either. And then a little while later, that toad that was stuck in the rut goes speeding past, just hopping really, really fast. And so the toad catches up, hops and catches up, says, I thought you were stuck in that rut. What happened? So I was, but then a car was coming. So I might tell a story about being stuck in a rut like that as a way of saying, if you've got the right level of motivation, you can find a way out of this. People talk about wanting to get perspective. So you then might tell a story relating to, say, a bird flying, or It could be talking about someone mountain climbing. They climb to the top of the mountain, they get perspective. Or if you're someone who's been on a holiday, say to Scotland, you might talk about when you went to Scotland and you climbed the mountains and you looked back over everything. So you're telling your own personal story about a true event from your own life, but you're talking about gaining perspective. People say things like they're just digging their heels in. Or they may even, this is another one that could even happen physiologically, that you talk to a client and you see them digging their heels in. You see them rock back on their chair and push their heels in. So you might then tell you might think, well, the therapy's not going to work unless we can address this digging heels in thing. So you then tell a story that incorporates digging heels in and then somehow turns that into a positive outcome. So they dug their heels in until they learnt a certain understanding or whatever it happens to be. People talk about how their skin crawls. They'll say, that just made my skin crawl. So again, you can then use that metaphor and turn it into a story. In relation to pain, people talk about it being sharp pain, stabbing pain, burning pain, throbbing pain, searing pain. They talk about all different versions of pain. So again, you can take the metaphors they use. Say someone talks about sharp pain. You can tell stories that involve a lot of references to things being sharp and then that being blunted down. So you could talk about, for example, geology and the creation of the Grand Canyon, and talk about it being sharp and jagged rocks that have been worn down over the years until there's just a nice soft trickle of water. You want to, as a way of finding metaphors, also use your own metaphors and stories you know. People often say to me, how on earth do you come up with all these metaphors, all these stories? I can't remember anything. I can't remember this. I can't remember that. 90% of what I come up with is given by the client when I say to the client, what is it you'd like help with? And the other 10% are just stories from my own life, or stories about nature, things that I find fascinating in nature, like the growth of trees and plants, and a lot of other aspects of the natural world. And there's also obviously stories I've learned. So I've grown up learning nursery rhymes. I've grown up learning children's stories. All of these are brilliant to use. I've grown up reading books and watching films. Again, all these stories are really good to use. Some stories really seem to endure, and they're generally stories that are really powerful and really good stories and contain a lot. So things like Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. Homer was the first to write them down, but he wasn't the one who came up with them. Those stories were being carried through oral tradition long before they were written down, centuries ago. But they're still very big, very popular stories about things like the sirens luring people to the shores to make the boats crash on the shores, about Medusa, about the Trojan horse and making it so that all the soldiers are inside the Trojan horse. It gets wheeled into the fort, into the castle, and then they come out at night and can kill everyone inside the castle. So all of these are stories just from the Odyssey and the Iliad that can be really powerful, really helpful to use. And I only know them from reading and watching films and things like that. So your own personal knowledge can be brought to the table. Things in the environment and information that you know about the client can be really helpful. So if you're in a room and there's a certain picture on the wall, maybe you can integrate that picture. If they're wearing certain type of clothing or have certain jewelry, maybe you can deduce something about them or learn something that you think that would be really helpful. Maybe from information you've gathered about the client beforehand, before they came for a session, or information you're gathering in the session, can give you some insight. So you find out some hobbies they like. Maybe they like sailing, or maybe they like playing snooker, or maybe they like going for long walks. So all of these ideas can then be integrated into the stories you tell, so that it sounds and feels nice and personal. If in the environment, say it's really noisy outside the therapy office, and maybe you're on a busy road, perhaps you could integrate the fact that it's a noisy environment into the story, like telling the story of, say, a prince or a princess coming out their castle and heading into town, and the town being full of hustle and bustle and being really busy. So you can use these different environmental factors. If it's really nice, hot, sunny weather, maybe you incorporate the fact it's hot, nice, sunny weather. Likewise, if it's grey and drizzly or raining, you incorporate that. And you can also use the hypnotherapy training tool to practice finding and using metaphors. So what it does is it creates random clients and random bits of information. Some bits talking about what problem they want to overcome, some of their strengths and hobbies, and it gives their age, so you can have an idea of what is someone of that age, what's their life experience been. So for example, I'm about 40 years old, so if you knew that about me, you know I've grown up in a pre-computer era, that my childhood didn't involve mobile phones, didn't involve computers, or very, very unlikely to have involved computers, didn't really involve that many computer consoles or other types of computer games. And things like social media and that lot was a lot less then, in fact didn't exist. So, and news was completely different then. So although the world is a safer place now to when I was a child, it felt safer back then. And so you often hear people say the world is a safer place now. And yet people also point out that, oh, there seems to be constantly negative news. And that seems to scare parents. So parents, when I was a child, let their children go out and play a lot more. So if you know this about me and you know my age, you'll know that I probably spent a lot of my childhood out playing, because that's what kids of my generation did. So when it comes to then telling stories, you can integrate things like that. You can integrate things that will make me reminisce. And if you just wonder, I don't 100% know what kind of information or what kind of information he's got to say, I don't know about his past or anything, you can just ask, what sort of things are you interested in? What sort of things do you enjoy? What did you used to do for fun when you were younger? And you can just ask these kind of questions, and that will give you tons of information you can use when forming your stories. I don't normally ask that much information, because so much information is given just by asking a client what they would like help with, that to add in all that extra information is just a huge amount of additional content. So it's really helpful content if you would like it, but it's not necessary.